today it's our pleasure to have Dr. Sabine O'Hara, who's currently the Vice President for Academic Affairs and Dean of Concordia College in Minnesota. She has degrees, both a master's degree in Ag Econ and a PhD in Environmental Economics from Göttingen College in Germany. And she's worked for the Council of Churches as a policy analyst and was at RPI along with John Erickson until 1999 when she moved to Green Mountain College here in Vermont to become provost. And she recently took up her current post in Concordia. And she's going to talk about the role of local participation in residents' needs in sustainable development. But let me just remind people, in case you haven't been to previous talks, that we're passing out little slips of paper to write your questions on. We'll collect those at the end of the talk. And then our panel of student inquisitors will summarize those questions and ask them to the speaker or questions that they've gotten over the web from other students that are taking the course for credit. Okay. Sabine, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Delighted to be here to speak to you about one of my favorite topics, namely not just sustainable development, but participatory approaches to sustainable development. So I've entitled my talk, Sustainable Development, Participatory Approach to Economic Development, or you could also say, development as if residents mattered. So why is this a big deviation from mainstream economic analysis and mainstream approaches to development? Well, without going into any great detail here, what you see here is sort of an attempt to put the economy into context. And what you have in the center is market economic activity, surrounded by, embedded in, if you will, economic activity that is non-market, such as subsistence activity, the underground economy, the informal sector, all of those things that are not captured in the market but are nonetheless economic activity, which is in turn embedded in the human social context, social activities such as getting together with neighbors and friends, political participation, participation in our community institutions, and so forth. And that in turn is embedded in the environment. Now, I saw on your list of speakers that a few weeks from now Herman Daly is going to be here, and he will tell you a story of when he worked at the World Bank, when he made an attempt to put this kind of view of the economy forward in a World Bank document, and the graph was eliminated from the document because it simply didn't fit into the analytical framework to have the market economy viewed as being embedded in a context, because essentially what we do in mainstream economics, all value is assigned, both value to human and non-human, social and material contributions are assigned value through their participation in the market economy. And they are devoid of value simply in and of themselves. So we don't have any contextual view of the market economy like this graph attempts to show, where value is also attributed to the context systems itself, so that social activity itself, that the environment itself has intrinsic value and does not just gain value through their participation as input factors into the market economy. Well, that context view also takes into account that there then are feedback loops. Something happens to the non-market economic activity, something happens to human social activity, and something happens to the environment as they interact with what we call the market economy. There are feedback loops and there are qualitative changes that take place through this interactive system. And this embedded view, this context view, takes account of that. But this is not the mainstream economic view. So you might say, well, is this all pure theory? And the answer is no. It's not just pure theory, but this theoretical approach has very significant consequences. For example, we measure economic progress in terms of GDP. So the dominance of the contextless view of the economy has very significant consequences. My understanding is that some of you are engaged in calculating the ISEW or the GPI for this region, and of course there have been a number of studies that have calculated GPIs or ISEWs for countries. So there is an alternative approach, but the dominant view simply takes GDP as an indicator for economic progress, and therefore growth in the goods, final goods and services produced, measured in dollars, is the decisive indicator. And of course the policies that result from that are also pretty consequential. Namely, the attempt then is to simply have GDP grow rather than having ISEW grow. Or other alternative indicators. On what economists would call the meso level, not the macro level, but the meso level, we have similar implications from this contextless view of the economy. Namely there, one of the driving models that determines policies for regional economic development and local economic development has been the base model of economic development. Now the base model works something like this. If you identify a base sector in your economy, a central sector, often, particularly here in the Northeast, that has been the one company in the one company town, if our policies support that base sector, and that base sector then gets strengthened through incentives, through tax cuts, through other policy measures that would help it grow, then somehow the rising tide will lift all ships. And if the base sector is healthy, then the rest of the economy will be healthy too. So the base theory argument goes. Because if people are healthy and well in the base industry, they will then have to purchase other goods and services, and therefore there will be other indirect and induced effects from that growth model, and everybody will be better off. Well, the interesting thing is that if you look at the empirical literature, this is not a conclusive model for economic development. Because it's sort of like a hit and miss. You know, some empirical studies would lead us to believe that it has been successful in some regions. In other regions, the model has just failed miserably, as some base sectors have expanded and then moved out altogether, leaving communities behind with depleted resources and decaying economic base, brownfields, and all the rest of it as a consequence. An alternative model to regional development came around in the 1970s when people said, well, so maybe we do need to look not just at the supply side and what drives economic development, but maybe we do need to take demand more into consideration. That approach I've termed sort of the beautification model, and I think you all know examples of that as well. It goes something like this. You know, people want to have it convenient. And so if we want to have people come into our downtown areas and so forth and give economic vitality to our communities, then we have to make it convenient for them to come there or to go there. And so the result was that we built a whole lot of parking garages. And I know, downtown here, we have some examples of that too, of that initial approach. And if you go to any number of US cities, you'll find lots of parking garages in these communities, and nowhere the vitality that, or not necessarily the vitality that Burlington has in its downtown area, because the parking garages alone, of course, won't do it. The exodus followed to the mall and the better and bigger stores and even more convenient access. However, there was nonetheless an attempt in the beautification model to broaden the view and to take more the consumption sector into consideration. What neither one of these models does, however, is ask consumers what actually would be convenient to them or desirable to them. Neither one of these models does that. That's a problem, because what really drives economic development is people's pursuit of a good quality of life. And empirical studies on regional developments substantiate that. And that is why we have had quite substantial movement in this country. People like the climate in the Southwest. They like Colorado. They like some of the southern states where quality of life factors tend to be high, and it is the migration of populations into other centers that then lead to economic development. In other words, the migration comes first, the development follows, and it's not necessarily the other way around. So how do we measure quality of life? Well, two approaches. One, the indicator approach, where we try to find a number of indicators that help us get a handle on what the sort of squishy concept of the quality of life is and how we might measure that. The second approach, which is also referred to as subjective assessment, takes people's opinion and simply asks, what do you like? What don't you like? How could we improve things? And how would you go about improving things in this community or in this region? Here's an example of typical indicator categories, and they're not new. This particular list that breaks specific indicators down into 5 indicator categories actually goes back to the development literature in the late 60s and early 70s, where these indicator categories were used to advise developing countries in terms of what they should seek to achieve in their development strategies. So those 5 categories are demographic and human resource indicators, government and politics indicators of civic engagement, if you will, indicators of economics and wealth, indicators of health and education. What about environment? Well, when most indicator approaches of the early indicator approaches were developed, environmental indicators were not necessarily part of the mix. They've come along later. But there is often a tricky issue with adding environmental indicators. Namely, they're not necessarily talked about in the same way by even different regions within this country, much less if you move into the international arena. We often hear, for example, that environmental concerns are the concerns of white, well-educated, middle-class people. And therefore, they are not mentioned or rarely mentioned when it comes to discussions of urban development, of more ethnically mixed communities, and so forth. Now, having done a few studies that take subjective indicator approaches or subjective survey approaches, I would very much argue that. And I would submit to you that really what the issue is that people talk about the environment in different ways. And one common way of talking about the environment is to talk about aesthetics or to talk about recreational activities. So I wanted to keep that in mind as we then continue on by looking at a study. So what's the advantage of seeking participation and seeking input from local residents? Well, one of the advantages is that you find out how people actually conceptualize and think about these things. One of the articles I had asked you to read is an article that I'd entitled Valuing Sociodiversity, and it argues that the loss of social diversity and our diverse institutions and approaches to interacting in civil society, that loss of diversity is maybe equally as serious as the loss of biodiversity. So I'm not going to go into any detail here, but I hope that that article has given you at least a taste of what different approaches and different lenses are that people bring to this question of what would be desirable improvements in the quality of life and what would be desirable development strategies. So the advantage is that you hear what people have to say and what their perceptions are. The disadvantage, of course, is, and as has been argued, with subjective approaches, that people may also get stuck, and that indicators that you might determine as being very important may or may not be taken into account. So you find out about the blind spots as well, if you will, and there then needs to be a deliberate attempt to bring the blind spots into the conversation if, in fact, serious things are overlooked through a participatory approach. So what's the reluctance for taking a participatory approach? Well, it's a messy approach, because working with surveys, with stakeholder groups, with local participation approaches is a tricky thing. You have to think through processes, who you would need to work with in a community to actually get access to the relevant groups, and who do you need to bring to the table to really have it be a full and representative conversation that doesn't simply replicate biases by just taking the dominant view into account. And it's a time-consuming approach, because your time is not your own when you work with lots of different groups in communities. So what I want to walk through with you is a survey that I did in Poultney, Vermont, just about an hour and a half south of here in the Slate Valley of Vermont. And this survey was taken with a class of undergraduate students who actually went door to door to residents in the town of Poultney. We had developed a structured questionnaire that they used, similar to the questionnaire that we used in the survey in downtown Schenectady that you all read an article about, or at least you received an article about. I'm not sure if you've all read it. So a questionnaire that asked about what are residents' needs, how do residents assess the quality of life in this community, and what kind of follow-up work might we undertake to improve their quality of life and to give them access to needs, to services that were identified as needs. So students actually went door to door with the structured questionnaire. We then analyzed it, and we worked closely with the town of Poultney, who at that time the town was eager to get some of that data, because we had formed a steering committee, if you will, that sought to receive downtown designation through this downtown development designation through the state of Vermont. Not quite sure where this stands at this point, because as I said, as Bob said, I've left last summer to move out to Minnesota. But we had received a planning grant from the state of Vermont to pursue downtown designation. And if that process turns out to be successful, Poultney would actually be the smallest community, smaller even than Vergennes, which is another community here in the state that had received downtown designation through the state of Vermont. So there was a good willingness to participate in this process by the town and the village. And you see here the percentage participation. Most of them from the village, come from the town, and another interesting part of the town that we labeled as sort of a subgroup. There is a very strong summer population on Lake St. Catherine, and so we labeled that as a separate sub-cohort in our survey. Here is what the age distribution is like, and to see how we were doing and how close or how far our survey population deviated from census data. I've given you here two census surveys as comparison. The darker one is from the 1990 census, the red one is from the 2000 census, and then the light green or turquoise one is the survey population. So you can see we've underestimated the under 18-year-olds here in our survey sample, which was kind of surprising because I certainly thought that given the number of students that participated in the survey as surveyors, as interviewers, that they would go really through their residence halls and get good participation from their fellow students, but that was not necessarily the case. We're doing pretty well in the 18 to 24-year-old sample, so that's the main bulk of the student population. As you can see, the census data is very inconclusive as to where we are. We're probably sort of right on because we're sort of smack dab in the middle between the 1990 and the 2000 survey. But census surveys have trouble working with student populations who are fluctuating. So depending on when the census takes place, they either have a good handle on that sample or not. But fairly good representation. This is what the income levels are of our survey sample. Not what you would find in Burlington, but nonetheless, given the summer population, a surprisingly high percentage of household incomes above 100,000. Here's what their employment status is. Most of them are full-time employed. I think what's noteworthy here is the high percentage of retired. And here is where they are employed. Now here you can see the influence of Green Mountain College in a small community like that. The education sector is by far the highest employment sector in that community. And distribution of education levels, again, fairly high. And here's what households answer to the question of what kind of services, what kind of businesses, but what kind of service providers would you like to see locate in this community? Very high desire for recreational activities, movie theater, but also shopping, not all that surprising in a small community like that, although everybody was eager to add, but we don't want to be a Manchester. And here's a ranking of the services according to importance. And this was an open question. So it simply asked what kind of services would you like, and then we had sort of a grid where people could write it in, and then rank is this a very important one or not so important, and how would you evaluate that? And on the top of the list is a community center and youth center. We had conducted a couple of focus groups prior to the survey, and that's another important issue. I shouldn't simply skip that. So before our students went out to conduct the survey, we had two focus groups where we brought in members of the community, certainly steering committee members, but also, the town manager was part of it, high school students, broad representation, and we walked through the questionnaire with them and asked them, does this sound okay? Are there other things we should add? Are there things we've stated in a manner that doesn't make sense to you, and so forth? So lots of input in the construction of the questionnaire itself. which is not always an easy thing, because then if you want to analyze that questionnaire afterwards, sometimes that poses a problem, how you code the questions that are modified in such a participatory process. But community center, youth center, in other words, a strong need for social interaction in the community. Healthcare comes up right away, affordable housing, and then a number of needs for recreational activities. Here is a ranking question quite similar, but this was one where we had given a list of services and we had asked people to rank the list of services that we had provided. And there is a bit of a difference because we didn't provide the community center or youth center or anything similar to that on the list. And it was surprising that while it didn't come out in the focus groups, it came out very strongly in the survey itself. Here is how residents describe their favorite recreational activities. A lot of outdoor activities, lots of hiking and biking and fishing and swimming. High appreciation for their natural surrounding, which comes up again. In this question, namely, what are desired improvements in the community, and again, the community center ranks very high. Physical/aesthetic improvements, again, this goes back to my earlier point that in the open questions, rarely do people bring up what we might call, as researchers, what we might term environmental quality factors, but it's often captured in aesthetic improvements and in recreational improvements. Here's one of the problem areas. How do people view the educational system as one of the indicator categories of quality of life? Not very highly. And that becomes a problem, as I can tell you from my experience as chief academic officer there, because that's one of the headaches that you have in recruiting faculty, who first ask, what are the schools like? So in this case, if this community, and the same is true incidentally for health services too, so if this community really wants to make some headway in becoming a community that people recognize as one of having a high quality of life, there is definitely some work that needs to be done in education and in the healthcare area as well. But what do people view as the biggest assets of this community? Number one, by far, is the small size, and number two, the natural beauty of the area. And these are the quality of life rankings. That's a question that we closed with, where we simply asked, so how do you assess the quality of life in this community? Overall, quite high. But of course, it's sort of a tough category to get a handle on, because unless you break it down further, as we attempted to do in the questionnaire, it may mean very different things to different people. So what are follow-up steps from that kind of work? Well, you can do a number of things. One, it helps you communicate the community's assets. What do people value about it, and how then can you present that in a way that you can communicate both to the community and to the outside in order to instill pride, if you will, appreciation for the community assets. Secondly, it helps you to identify potential markets. Recreational activities is one, but certainly a number of services. Actually, is follow-up, a restaurant opened. I hope they're still there. Again, I haven't been there in a while now, but that was a clear need of the community, and last I knew they were doing quite well. But a number of other potential markets like that, like the bakery that you saw listed, and certainly other recreational activities that were very prominent. This kind of an approach then allows you to identify potential market and to solicit interested micro-enterprise operators, if you will, to locate in the community as a follow-up. So supporting micro-enterprise startups then might be another follow-up step, whereby that would require then that you as a community think about, so how do we do that, and what are the means that we have to put in place in terms of support services and so forth to actually make that happen. And fourth, identifying public-private partnerships, because the community center, for example, is not the kind of thing where you can find easily private sector interested takers in offering that kind of a service to the community. But lots of follow-up potential in terms of seeking public-private partnerships to make that possible. So what's the conclusion from this kind of work? And I thought you might be interested in this more, in this particular study that's more close to home for you here in Burlington. But other studies show similar conclusions, namely context does matter. People are quite articulate about how they value the social context and the environmental aesthetics, if you will, within which they live and within which their economic activity takes place. One of the things that's striking about these kinds of survey approaches is that social interaction and the quality of the social environment comes up time and time again very strongly. And it would lead me to believe that one of the things we need to do first and foremost as economists is to recover some of the more traditional view of the economy, namely not just as an abstract sort of removed market economy, but as a place of social interaction, because that's how market economies actually started out and how they were first conceived. And what are future research questions? There are lots of them, and lots of interesting ones, I would say. Namely one, and I think one of the articles that I had also given you is one entitled Quality of Life, Who Evaluates, or something like that, which raises the question, namely, if you do take subjective approaches through surveys or through stakeholder discourse, which often is an important follow-up step after a survey like this, the question is, of course, who comes to the table? And how can you provide a broad enough participatory process to have also those views represented at the discourse table that are not necessarily very strongly represented otherwise? What expectations and behaviors are rational? Now, this is an economic theory question because, of course, we have a very narrowly determined definition, narrowly defined definition of consumer's rationality and producer's rationality. And what some of these approaches show clearly is that that needs to be broadened. And we need to do a much better job to take social and environmental quality factors into account because people do take them into account when you ask for that. And what policies reinforce context-specific versus these universalizable conditions of development and of markets? And I've given a couple of examples already early on. Certainly the macroeconomic policies that would lead to an increase of the ISEW or the GPI would be very different macroeconomic policies than those that we currently have in place that seek to increase the GDP. And likewise, at the meso level, at the regional or community-based development level, those policies that would increase quality of life in a community might be quite different than those policies that seek to expand the base sector. So with that, I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
select the other questions from the
All right, this is from the reading.
Tammy? Do we need to turn this on somewhere else?
Alright, this is from the readings, and 12 people asked this question. How can we get people at a large scale to realize that the choices they make are not one-time games against faceless players, but rather a choice in a series of related actions with fulfilling consequences for their communities?
Do you have any other easy questions? How can we get people to realize that? Well, you know, I think when you are in these conversations, when you actually sit down with stakeholders in a community or with participants, in the Schenectady survey that you read about, we had lots of follow-up work. We had some follow-up work in the Poultney survey up to this point, where we, for example, held a public meeting and said, let's first walk you through what you all said about your community. What were some of the answers you gave in the survey? In the Schenectady case, we had lots of follow-up conversations where we asked people, so who is actually interested in starting a microenterprise, in helping to meet some of these needs that were identified in these urban neighborhoods. And people are aware that their actions have consequences. Often, the way we have constructed our communities is not exactly very conducive to making it easy for people to act in such a way that we all participate in developing a sustainable community. If you go back to the urban survey, for example, transportation was a huge issue. I think, if I remember correctly, there were only just over 50% of the households that participated in that survey, which was a very high participation rate. About almost 2/3 of these neighborhoods participated, and almost 40% of the residents didn't have cars. Hard for us to imagine. So how people behave is often not necessarily a matter of choice, but a matter of other constraints. And that's why these are pretty complex questions for us to think through. So given those kinds of constraints on transportation, for example, how can we then make it easier for people to find access to needed services and to participate in a way that they would feel good about?
Some people ask this question. To what extent can discourse-based evaluation internalize economics, given that some citizens and corporations will remain outside of the process and choose instead to optimize their short-term gain rather than contribute to the common good? Will this problem eventually lead to the loss of even more social diversity?
Would this approach lead to more of a loss of social diversity?
Yes.
Oh, I would say the opposite is true. See, what we assume in the market is that people adequately communicate their preferences, their desires, their needs through the market. So the vehicle by which that happens is demand, and indirectly, if you will, the price that people are willing, and then we add, of course, as economists, willing and able. Never mind that part of already. That goes again, speaks again to the constraints that people have to whether they actually can participate or not. So that's a fairly narrow means of participating in a process that determines development strategies in a community. You are correct Discursive approaches do need to be careful to have broad-based representation. So you're not just replicating the views that are already very verbal or very prominent in a community. To that extent, that's a valid point. The broad-based participation is absolutely necessary. And even as a facilitator in discourse processes, you need to be aware of the existing biases. We are a very technically oriented, very quantitatively oriented society in how we attempt to measure, weigh, and value things. And it is important to be cognizant of those biases, because those are the ones who we call the experts. The experts are those with technical skills. The experts are those who have a good handle on quantitative measurements and so forth. And then there are these other people who want to talk about this sort of squishy, mushy stuff, you know, that's sort of hard to quantify and not very tangible. And it is important in discourse processes to be aware of those biases and to give voice to those less accepted local expertise contributions that are equally as valid as the credentialed expertise contributions that we more commonly associate with expertise. So you do need to be able to find a way of sort of leveling the playing field in the discourse process. But if you're able to do that, those other views, those other alternative views, if you will, can come to the fore. Whereas if you don't provide the ability for those views to be articulated, then we're just all going to be subsumed under the existing measuring systems. So not necessarily an easy challenge, but it can be done, I think, more adequately in discourse processes. Even in the indicator approaches, you know, if you have multi-indicator approaches, which are very valuable and certainly shed much additional light on what qualitative factors we need to take into consideration in a community. But if you then try to determine development strategies based on multi-indicator approaches, somebody has to weigh the trade-offs. And so at some point, you're going to have to sit down and have a conversation about that. So how do we weigh those trade-offs?
This is also from the reading about people ask a question similar to this. Americans are caring less and less about each other and the general good and focusing more on themselves. People do not understand the importance of local goods because of this distance. Will the American public be willing to work on a more global level rather than focusing on the individual? Would a person who lives in the city consciously think about the source of the produce they buy and the farmer who helps supply the crop?
I wished I had given you another reading, and I'm going to send it to Bob. I did a survey with one of my former PhD students from RPI, Sigrid Stagel. She did a survey of CSAs, Community Supported Agriculture. And there we asked CSA members, so why are you a member of the CSA? Does it have to do with the food you get? You know, it's healthy stuff, it's all organically grown, you know where it comes from and so forth. Or are you aware of some of the other factors, like you're actually part of the process, you are engaged with the farmer, you help level the risk of the farmer, you bear part of the risk by paying your share in advance of the growing season and so forth. All of those characteristics of CSAs. And then we surveyed a control group of non-CSA members in an urban setting. And our anticipation, of course, was, number one, these people are not going to know necessarily what CSAs are, nor are they necessarily interested in participating. Well, the prohibiting factor was money and access, because if you don't have transportation, it's pretty darn hard to pick up your share in the basement of the church once a week. So the data actually showed that people were quite interested in in participating in those community-based interactions. But again, it often goes to what are other constraints that we place on people? You know, and again, I would argue it goes back to sort of the, you know, the power of the market economy. If value is determined by means of how much participation there is, how much wages are gained, and so forth through the market, then you are already creating a bias, right? And you see that bias in that if you analyze over the last 20, 30 years what happened in American communities, more and more services that used to be provided in the informal sector have moved into the market. That starts with household services, but it also includes lots of community services. If you want to read an interesting analysis about that, read Robert Putnam's book, Bowling Alone, The Emptying of Social Space in Our Communities. And it is, to no small extent, this valuation system that we're all, even if it is just sort of subconsciously aware of, that it is a wage that determines our value, and it is our participation in the market economy that determines our value. And so it becomes pretty hard to sort of step out of that cycle and to provide for alternative systems. But you know, that's why it has to happen at the community level. It's pretty hard for individuals to be that countercultural all by themselves. It takes the support network of the community, and we need to provide that. So we need to be aware of the kind of factors that push people or exclude people from participating in alternative systems that would emphasize more social participation and less pressure to participate in the market.
This is a follow-up question from the audience. What about local currencies like Burlington bread and ticket hours as a solution to that?
Yeah, I mean, those are examples. I mean, the Schumacher Society has many examples that they've put together of how communities can become a more supportive network to offer alternatives to people, and the local currency system is one of those examples.
This is a question from the reading, and about 6 people asked this sort of question. Given the power inherent in our money, is it realistic to think a change to discourse valuation could willingly occur? Do you think that our country is capable of reconnecting at the community level at this stage of increasing globalization without some sort of economic catalyst or collapse?
Good question. Yeah, I don't know. You know, if you look at our economic condition right now, and if you look at the economic conditions in all of most of Africa, and if you look at the economic conditions in a good bit of Latin America and the former Eastern Europe, I'm wondering what's going to lead to more rapid collapse, if it really is an undermining of the economy by creating more local alternatives. I would question that. Actually, local alternatives create more economic diversity, and that is a stabilizing factor for local economies. That when you have an alternative to move into more, or in some cases it's really import substitution, that opens up more diverse alternatives in communities' local economy, that can be very much a stabilizing factor rather than a factor that contributes to destabilization. The most unstable economies are the very homogeneous ones, because if there is any problem with that kind of, in the base sector model, for example, if there's a problem with the base sector, then the bottom falls out of the economy, and you can see that in a number of communities in this country. And they have subsequently moved in, for example, if you take Seattle and its experience in the 70s with the downturn in the airline industry, and, the alternative was to become more diverse and to create alternatives, and that would balance out some of the weight of the base sector. So I would see that as a stabilizing factor. How realistic is it? Are people really going to do it? At least, my limited experience, and this is, and I stress that limited experience because this is sort of part of the time-consuming matter of this approach is it's happened sort of one community at a time. And so I can't give you a large-scale experience here of how this works. I know there are many different approaches where communities have taken more of more hold of their own local economies and have attempted to assess quality of life in their local communities. So I think it's a growing network. You know, how big or how small, or is it going to be the only thing? It's always going to exist in parallel with the market economy too, because we're going to have some specialization. I think it would simply be unrealistic to think that we can do all with local economies, but we can reintroduce a bit more balance than what we've moved to now.
The technologies, which can be agriculture, seem to inspire isolation rather than drive us to discourse. Do you believe we will have to sacrifice our present technologies to affect the change that we'll need to take on inspiring local and global discourse?
Well, there's been a big discussion about that. You know, does the internet actually contribute to public discourse, or does it undermine it? I'm not a good one to ask. I'm not a communication specialist, so I do think there is a significant value in face-to-face conversations and in providing for community interaction that allows for that, because it is a different means of communication than indirect communication through the communications, through electronic media and so forth. So on a larger scale, I don't know. I've heard both arguments, the argument that our technology contributes to larger participation, as well as the argument that it excludes even more people. On the other hand, we really need to make it an effort, you know, if we want to have economies or local communities that emphasize participation, then we really need to make it an effort and participate. And if you look at the town meetings in Vermont, they're not exactly a good indicator or a positive indicator in that regard, because participation in town meetings has declined. And that's a very unfortunate development, I would say. But it takes a deliberate effort, and again, it speaks to the pressures that people find themselves under, because as we work longer and longer hours, and as we become more and more engaged in trying to build up our own self-worth by what we have, there are conflicts. There are simply time constraints. And we need to find ways to recover that social participation. And I really mean face-to-face participation, not through electronic means.
This is a question from the audience. It's sort of a follow-up to what you just said. You can argue that a true democratic system takes time. How do we encourage participation in discourse-based decision-making when we already have low voter turnout, which takes a relatively short amount of time?
Yeah, good question, and I can't argue with that. It's an uphill battle, but I think it's a very worthwhile uphill battle, you know. And if you look at other expressions of democratic participation, look at some of the recent responses to the prospect of a war in Iraq. So it does indicate to me that people can be motivated, but we need to find means to do so.
You suggest in your reading an alternative process to assess and manage the competing demands of interrelated economic, social, and environmental systems, which rely on the decentralized open discourse of informed citizens. Who do you think will be the first to implement these ideas? Will it be countries such as Argentina, who have witnessed firsthand how ways of organizations like the World Bank do not work? Or will it be more developed countries which have the foresight to change their economic systems for the better?
I have to admit I haven't thought about that, because I've not worked in the developing countries enough to be able to say that, really, to be able to answer that. But I think the potential is there in both contexts. And I think certainly when it comes to some approaches to local development or relying on local economies, I would say some of the developing countries have some pretty strong models. It's just that with some of our economic advising that we have done, we've discouraged those kinds of models, and we have pushed many of these countries more and more into the market economy, either by advising them to move into cash crops or by advising them to move into extraction, of precious metals and so forth, or oil into extraction sectors. So I think, at least my concern is, and that's what I was arguing in this sociodiversity article, although I was again looking more at diversity even within our own context as the United States. But what my concern is that by marketing our policy approaches all over the globe, we are losing alternatives that we could well learn from.
Do you feel that the government needs to sponsor more studies like the Genuine Progress Indicator or their own to start that public working towards a more sustainable future?
It's interesting that you asked that. I just told Bob earlier today, we at Concordia College, we just hosted a Peace Prize Forum. We are one of a consortium of 5 colleges of Norwegian heritage. And as such, we are a consortium of 5 colleges that are the only colleges in the US who host the Nobel Peace Prize Forum. The Nobel Institutes support that. The Nobel Institute director was actually on our campus for that event. And as you can imagine, the event just took place this past weekend. And so the timing was just impeccable. And we had a huge turnout because everybody wanted to talk about peace. And we had one of the UN ambassadors because, for obvious reasons, Kofi Annan, who had actually been our keynote speaker, called about a month ago and said, "I'm sorry, I absolutely cannot leave New York." And so he sent one of the ambassadors, actually the ambassador to the poorest countries, as his substitute. We had Richard Holbrooke, and in one of the sessions that I led, one of the seminar sessions, Walter Mondale participated. And the title of my session was actually a bit esoteric, so I had anticipated that there wouldn't be too much interest, because what my title was the subtle and not so subtle ways of the economic system's contribution to aggression. The not so subtle ways being conflicts over resources, the subtle ways being really sort of this isolationist decision maker model that we paint in our economic models, and that has very real policy consequences. That's not just a theory. And so Walter Mondale asked, so how can we as politicians help to strengthen some of these heterodox approaches to economic that I described in the session? And I said, one good way would be to give us some research dollars, because let's face it, in the academy, that's how we become validated as individual disciplines, be that ecological economics or social economics. And I have been very much involved in both of these fields and societies that are associated with these fields. And it does take that kind of external recognition for us to get on and to become more influential and more prominent in how we are perceived by policymakers. So this is a bit of a catch-22 situation. The policymakers look to mainstream economics for guidance and keep funding it. And I just hope that at some point there'll be sufficient groundswell of recognition that we need some alternative approaches. So I can't tell you what kind of outcome there will be from my just recent conversation with Walter Mondale on this, but it's interesting that you raised the question, because I think that's where it needs to start. Policymakers need to start raising questions and say, well, something isn't working right here. And I think we have had ample evidence that something isn't working right here.
This is another question from the audience. In the case of Poultney, many people value the small size and beauty of the town. However, in your research, many Poultney residents wanted outdoor recreation, movie theaters, and shopping. All of those would increase tourism, accelerate development, and encourage growth. Why do you think the citizens of Poultney had such conflicting wants, i.e. small town versus development associated with tourism?
You know, again, I mentioned earlier, people said we do need more shopping here and we do want more outdoor recreation, and by that, in the same sentence almost, they said, but we don't want to become a Manchester. We don't want an outlet town. So, and I think there are ways of meeting those objectives that are not necessarily in conflict. What we mean by outdoor recreation and what's happening now, for example, is that a nature trail is being developed. That trail connects the Poultney Elementary School to Green Mountain College, to East Poultney and its historical district, and then back along the Poultney River. So that's a good example where I don't think that's in conflict with sustainable development practices, and it does improve the recreational opportunities in the town, because this is an area that is virtually undeveloped.
How do you expect people to truly end their desire for easy all-around, all-you-need stores like the Walmarts or Home Depots, and have such consumers be concerned about where or how these products are being made? What will initiate such change, or rather, will be an initial incentive to such change? What would be?
Well, call me naive, but I think education plays a big role. Maybe this is spoken like a true educator, but, and I don't mean just education within the university system, but I mean education much more broadly based than that. You know, I've given lots and lots of talks over the last 10 years or so about alternative approaches to economic development. I've given lots and lots of talks about what exactly do we measure with the GDP, and what alternatives are there that would broaden our measurement system. And I'm always amazed how few people have thought about or have known what GDP actually measures. Whenever I've given a talk like that and people said, really, it's just final goods and services produced in dollars? Wow, that has really little or nothing to do with our quality of life. It's just really the volume of market goods that are produced and shuffled around. It does give pause, and it does lead people to question, so what exactly are we doing here? Now, you can argue there is, this is sort of a cumbersome approach, sort of one person at a time, one talk at a time, but of course I'm not by any means the only one who is speaking to these matters. Bob has been doing this for a long time too, and there are many others. So I think education definitely plays an important role. And we need to find better opportunities and more opportunities as people in the academy to connect with local communities. And we haven't necessarily done a really good job at that historically. We tend to talk to each other. And we need to make much more serious efforts to talk with people in local communities who have not necessarily been affiliated with us in the academy.
This is a question from the audience. Please comment on the inclusion of informal economic and deviant culture characteristics and quality of life indicators and participatory systems of decision making.
Say it again, please comment on
The inclusion of informal economic and deviant culture characteristics in quality of life indicators and
informal and deviant.
informal and deviant.
Must be a sociologist in the audience. And I'm not a sociologist. But informal sector, certainly, there are some interesting examples of that. If you want to look at, for example, Ellie Perkins' work. Ellie Perkins is at York University in Toronto. And there are a number of European researchers, particularly Denmark and Finland. So give me your email address and I'll send you some references. Their work has mostly focused on the informal sector and particularly on the contributions of women in households and in local communities. And how do you bring those contributions to the fore with discursive approaches?
Okay, this is the last question. Given your experience in survey research methods, what are the keys to high rates of participation and broad demographic representation?
Local connections. My first survey in Schenectady, it was an interesting story how that started. I was approached by two neighborhood associations, Hamilton Hill and Vale, who called me shortly after we moved to Schenectady, New York. My husband is a United Methodist pastor. And so in the newspaper in Schenectady was the obligatory little paragraph about the new pastor of First United Methodist and his wife, who is an economist at RPI. So they called me and said, we read that you're an economist and we want you to tell us what to do about the situation here with GE moving out and with everything sort of grumbling around us. Well, that was an interesting challenge because frankly, I hadn't thought too much about that, what could be done. And that was really my, my first impetus, if you will, to take the initiative and to transfer some of the other earlier discourse approaches that I had done and to develop survey approaches that would link survey work and discursive stakeholder participation work. But it was really the challenge of these two neighborhood associations that led me into that, in that direction. And it also speaks to that very question of what makes these high participation rates possible. I wasn't participating, I wasn't initiating that work as the researcher from RPI. I was initiating that work as the pastor's wife and worked with virtually all of the downtown churches. Those were our surveyors. And the pastors announced it from the pulpit that we were going to do this. And the neighborhood associations went on the local TV channel and said, when these students are going to come around and when these people from the churches are going to get their name tags are going to say, Schenectady Development Initiatives and please help them out. We really need to hear from you. The other thing is you need to take the community context into consideration as you develop your approach. In the Schenectady context, we knew that we were surveying very urban neighborhoods, very mixed neighborhoods with a fairly high percentage of non-English speaking participants. And so we developed a formal questionnaire, but then the surveyors went there as interviewers. And so they were doing the interview, they were writing while they were asking questions, and it was a conversation in somebody's hallway or in somebody's living room. Well, why is that? Well, because we knew, if we just put the survey in the mailbox, we weren't going to get a lot of feedback because if you happen to be Hispanic and you can read English not very well, you wouldn't fill out a long questionnaire like that. That takes you 30 minutes to do. In the Poultney situation, that was very different. There we distributed them. We talked to people as we dropped them off, but people mostly filled them out by themselves. And then we made it easy to collect them. So we had drop-off stations at the post office, we had drop-off stations at the town hall and at the bank and so forth. So you need to think through where do people congregate, what do they do, and what approaches are more suitable for the community, and you need to work through local networks to get those kinds of participation rates. Thank you.